in purchasing power. And we'll come back to how powerful that really is. 2023, over 23,000 disclosing companies and over 1,100 cities, states and regions. So we don't just have companies disclosing through CDP's platform, but also cities from around the world and regions and states. So we've seen a huge growth in the last few years, and I know from the looks of my colleagues' faces down there, it's been a stressful few years because the demand for this data has gone off the charts. And that's really, really important. This isn't, the reason for disclosure is really important. Again, you can't manage what you can't measure. That means for investors, that means for buyers, that means for governments, that means for companies themselves. And that data that is disclosed, that's vital. It's the foundation of this decision making. Now, the last few years, it's gone exponential, and particularly in this region, and that's what we're so excited about. So last year was over 66% of global market capitalization, 24% globally of an increase, and 300% increase in disclosure since the Paris Agreement, and our biggest places of growth across Asia. This is where we are seeing the most support, the most disclosure, and really quality data. And it's incredibly exciting. It's one of the reasons for prioritizing this region going forward for CDP's future. The biggest disclosing countries in our system are the United States. The second is China, and Taiwan is a big part of that disclosure. Japan is the third, the UK and Germany. Those are our main countries, and then yet we cover the whole world, and it's really quite extraordinary to see. And this data is used to track progress. It is not just used by investors and buyers, as I've said, but it's also used by governments as part of their stock takes for the UNFCCC and the COP. So I mentioned this region, and this is what's really exciting. Just last year, we saw a 22% increase in Taiwan. So I mentioned the countries in our system. We have over 30% now of disclosure within CDP, and the data is from Asia Pacific. And in Taiwan alone, as I said, 22% last year, so 624 companies. And what's really exciting is you see this increase in disclosure against water as well. I think that's really, really important. In 2023, 111 companies in Taiwan were first-time disclosures. And what's really exciting? Of the A scorers this year, we had about 400. 170 of them were from Asia Pacific. So this is not just filling in a form and a tick box exercise. These companies are disclosing across this region against some really quite stressful questions. I'm very aware of that. And the data we are receiving, they're receiving A's for their transparency. They are seen as leaders on these issues. 20 of those were from Taiwan, which is really exciting. And what we found in Taiwanese companies' disclosure, governance, risk management, metrics and targets, really great disclosure. Where we need to see more focus and action is in strategy. And this, we're going to discuss that a little bit. This is vital, because this is about a fundamental transformation of your strategy. It is about a fundamental change in how you do business. So we've heard already that disclosure is becoming mandatory all over the world, and I'm going to discuss that for a little bit. It's important. It's a map. This But what's the point of it all? It makes it visible so we can change decisions. Without that, disclosure is just words. But we have to see that decision-making changing, and that is where we come to the strategy. Just wanted to show you, 30% of the Taiwan Stock Exchange are disclosing through CDP now. Really exciting. And again, 22% increase last year. And that was made up of 111 companies. So, exciting. Now for CDP, we have what is called the ABCs of environmental disclosure and data use. So why do companies do this? How is this data used? So let me unpack that a little for you. The first one, access to capital. This is where CDP's history comes from. We went to investors and said, I think you need to take this risk very seriously. You need to be including it in your investment decisions. And we first spoke to institutional investors, which means equity portfolios, shareholders. And the investors said to us, it's very true, but we don't have the data to make the decisions. So we said, okay, we'll help you have the data. And then we turned to the companies. And we worked on behalf of those investors. Now, why did those investors care? Because this data helps them to work out the risks in their portfolios, to actually also be able to benchmark companies against each other. Now, is it really true that they perform better? Yes. There is enough academic literature to show now. We have an index that tracks CDP's A scores against the market index. And they all, depending on the index you use, that you're using as your benchmark, they will, on average, outperform those indices between 1 and 10%. Now, why is that? Some academics think it's because it is a proxy for good governance. An investor can tell that if a company has this level of sophistication, it is probably managing its risk across the board much better, right? Whether it's climate risk or other risk. So a proxy for governance. But it is not just equity where you have the access to capital conversation coming and the use case. It's also credit, fixed income products, critically corporate loans. Those banks that are currently facing even more regulation and supervisory regulation, they need to manage their portfolios. And if you know banks, credit is the biggest part of it. And it really matters to them, not only because they can manage that risk, because if they don't drive down the climate risk in their portfolios, they will be supervised. And that means that, from a central bank perspective, they will have more expensive access to capital. They will have less that they can leverage in their portfolios, which literally means less profits for a bank. So it matters. But not just that. They can produce more and more finance products that are green, that are climate resilient. This is a big new industry for the banking sector. And so CDP's data is utilized by those capital actors for this reason. And companies coming through CDP's system know that, because the banks and the investors are writing to them through CDP. We need to see this. If you get an A, you will get better access to capital. Is that true? Do they see that directly? Yes. Is it enough? No. But we are seeing an increasing trend in that, where companies who are benchmarked better against their peers are getting base points off, for example, their supply chain finance. Because they are minimizing the risk for a bank, for that big company in whose supply chain that company is. That means that company is decreasing the risk for that buyer. And for the company itself, it means you keep your buyer, you get better finance. So it's a beautiful win-win situation. So let's move on to the next one, and I think this is a really, really powerful one. We didn't expect this, how much companies would change their decisions based on how they performed against their peers. Because companies use this data to work out where they need to change their strategies, how they can become more competitive, how they can manage their risks and realize their opportunities better. Major driver for coming into our system, and a major driver for the use case, a major use case of this data, is to improve competitiveness and resilience. And then we come to the most powerful. And do you know that it took us a while to learn this? That you really care about your clients. You don't do business without your clients, right? So we have found an extraordinary, very powerful driver for this has been through buying power. And this data is utilized by those buyers to make different decisions. And are they making different decisions? Absolutely. We found that less than 3% of those companies have climate-related action in some way or another, a part of the contracts, the procurement contracts. Some of them go much further than that, but it is a huge driver for change. And then finally, compliance. I call this navigating regulation. CDP system got companies ready for the next wave of regulation. We will be here to get you ready for the wave that will come after that. And it is not just about mandatory disclosure regulation. It was mentioned this morning really well. It's also about initiatives such as the EU CBAM. This data will underpin a variety of regulation going forward. You saw just last week the United States Security and Exchange Commission bringing out their disclosure requirement. You know, the EU has a rather large disclosure requirement, and at the end of last week also voted on the directive for the due diligence, which means that companies have to take responsible for environmental degradation and human abuses across their supply chain. Right? So, and that's across their supply chain. It's a really powerful directive. CDP system supports companies navigating that regulation. Because it's not just about data, it is because when you have to create that data, you're managing it. Many companies already have programs and systems on these issues, whether it be water security, whether it be deforestation, whether it be biodiversity, whether it be climate change. But bringing them together at a global level, tracking it in a standardized way, making it part of your ERP systems, your enterprise reporting systems, that's the key. And that is what we seek to trigger, catalyze within corporate governance systems. I call it the internal infrastructure that allows a company to navigate that regulation, because you are managing the risks that that regulation is looking at, and you have the data flows within it. That's really, really, really critical. And the next few years, we will only start to see this change much more rapidly. There we go. Now, I'm just going to give you a sense of how much change there has been. So in 2000, the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, produced the very first standard, right? And many of you may apply this standard. They have standards across all of the ESG spectrum. We were formed around the same time. And you can see, these are just examples of some of the standards that came into the space, which we adopted and brought into CDP system. So for example, in 2017, you had the launch of the TCFD recommendations. Those were in large part based on CDP's disclosure platform framework, as well as a standard framework that we had hosted the Secretariat of, the CBSB. And we aligned immediately, because we could see now we have a standardized set. We could see that this could become the baseline for regulation going forward. And we found our systems, we don't want to create something new. We are not a standard. One of our greatest advisors calls it through a metaphor. We are not the recipe writers. We are the pot in CDP that the soup gets cooked in. And it gets cooked in, and you put a bit of salt, too much salt, change the recipe, feed that back to the standard. Our aim is to make these standards converge, to make them interoperable, to make them globally relevant, so that you can compare the data, and so that companies are not facing thousands of different regulations, which we have the potential for coming up, and I'll run through that. So you can see some of the changes. That is where we align with the forest framework. You've got the CEO water mandate in 2007. I think the exciting things I would note is this big shift in the ISSB and the EU in their standards. And in 2024, CDP system, so that's this year, will be fully aligned with the ISSB S2 climate standard. So that climate standard in the ISSB is S2. We'll be fully aligned. That alignment has been signed off by the actual standards body. And this is really important. It will have companies ready. And then we will be aligning over time with the TNFD. So that is the parallel of the TCFD, but for nature. Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosure. And if you've been disclosing through CDP, you've already set yourself up quite well for all of these standards. But what really, really matters to us, this is a lot, and we're aware of that. It's a lot. And every dollar that is spent on reporting is $1 less on action. Right? It's really important. We have heard you. Reporting burden is real, because the compliance coming at you now as a company is different from different places. And we have it as our mantra and as our strategy to make it write once, read many. One data point should be able to be used. You should only have to write it once. And it should be able to be used by all of those different stakeholders. Capital actors, buyers, yourselves, and regulators. And that's what we seek to partner to make that happen. It's our mantra. One input, many outputs. Critically, it needs to be comparable. That's why we're leaning into align at a global scale. So I've already mentioned the S2 standard. Why do we do this? Because it helps companies to prepare. It reduces your reporting burden. It supports harmonization. How does it reduce your reporting burden? Because it can help make sure that the regulation that comes in globally, companies are already doing. And then it means that governments can adopt one standard, a global baseline standard. And that's really important. We proved that with TCFD, with you. And the TCFD therefore had enough foundational data, foundational action to move on to the ISSB. That's the power of a global disclosure platform. Now, this data must track progress. We've heard this morning about how much change we need to undergo, and there's a very good reason for that. We are behind globally in climate action. We are behind. And at CDP, we are for future generations. And right now, Our scientists are saying to us all over the world, it is not fast enough. It is not quick enough. Climate change is happening at speed. And so we need to be able to know that this data can track progress because we have to make progress. And in our system, we track measuring and managing your strategy looking forward, the target you set. This is really key, and it's really quite difficult when you set one of these targets. And then having a transition plan against that target, and then the performance over time. This is the vital steps, the 5-step journey. At the moment, of all the companies in our system, only 24% are on track to meet their targets. That's quite a daunting figure. A very small percentage of companies, of those companies even, have set science-based targets. So that's the full disclosure. Science-based targets, much, much smaller. And that's the level of ambition you need to meet what scientists say are credible, right? Although in Taiwan, really excitingly, we have 67 companies who've set science-based targets. And now we need to move on to transition plans. So now, we started asking about transition plans in 2015, and there's nothing radical about it. My grandmother could have told you that's the next thing, right? You set a target, you then make a plan to meet the target. Done. But what you're finding now is all over the world, investors are going, how do I know if this company, even though they've set a science-based target, they've validated their target, how do I know they are transitioning? You measure their plan. And so what's happened is you've seen transition plans become part of the ISSB, become part of the EU's regulation, because you're starting to see standard agreements on what those indicators actually are. Your financial incentives, your CapEx, your OpEx, your R&D budgets, your board, your governance, the makeup of your board. The UK government has been brought together a task force, the Transition Plan Task Force, the TPT, and it brought out a grounded set of indicators which looked at frameworks from around the world to make sure that there is potentially one framework that companies can use. We've been tracking this data for a long time. And there's a lot of companies who say they have a transition plan or they're preparing one, which is excellent. But when we look at, against all of those frameworks, when we look at where the disclosure they are disclosing against those indicators, we have a set of 21 indicators we see as the common across all the frameworks. It's less than 1% of companies disclose against all those. So that's where the job is now. That's where you roll up your sleeves. It's in the strategy, it's in transition planning. So, I think what's really exciting is that we're not just seeing action in emissions reduction, we're seeing action in adaptation. Now, I have been working in this field for a very long time, you can see. I'm looking very old and haggard at my stage. Lots of grey hairs. And it's always been the story. Yeah, I can see there could be some money in the transition, but there's no money in adaptation. Just not true. At least not from what companies tell us. There is a potential benefit to up to $15 for every dollar spent investing in adaptation, directly for companies. And as you can see, another example of this in nature, I mentioned this already, but suddenly everyone has realized that actually, another silly saying we have at CDP, if climate change is the shark, then water is its teeth. This is where climate change hits the road, water security. That's why this many companies are disclosing against it now. Because their investors are saying, this is an issue, we need that data. So we've had a 100% increase in companies in the last 5 years disclosing to the CDP on water data. So it's not just about climate on its own. It is about nature. So just when you thought you were getting a handle on climate, I'm telling you, transition plans. Roll up your sleeves. And then just when you thought you had a handle on that, I'm telling you, there's a lot more than just climate on its own emissions. So a holistic approach is critical, and CDP's system is planning to align and make sure it is holistic. It's frankly schizophrenic that we have this thing called climate and nature. That's mad, right? And so we need to take a holistic view, because actually all of these things link up to everything else. And your teams have been telling you this, and if you're a practitioner in the space, you know this already. They all link to each other. And what you invest in one thing can actually undermine the other, or can actually make the others better. And that interplay between things is really, really important. So just a few changes that we're making to our system. We want to help you get ready. Remember that mantra, write once, read many. $1 spent on reporting for every dollar, $1 less on action. We're going to make those dollars go up on action and support you to make sure that your data points can be written once. We will partner with governments, stock exchanges, investors, buyers, to make sure that that is the case, because at the moment the regulation is not all aligned. We want to support it to make it so. Because comparable data, we turn those standards into very long-winded standards into questions and into data points, specific data points, so that you can compare them and use them for decision. Now you will, if you've been disclosing through CDP, you will have remembered that we had many questionnaires. This year, one. There's one question bank, and the right companies will be asked the right questions in the right way. So you won't have duplicated questions. And if you are deemed relevant to water by your investors, or for forest, or for biodiversity, or for plastics, you will get those questions. If not, you won't. One integrated question bank, fully aligned with the ISSB S2. We have an expanded financial services questionnaire. We have, critically, and this is the most exciting thing, a standalone SME questionnaire. Simplified, streamlined, same data points, so that a buyer can compare small to big, but a much more simplified framework for the SME. And this, we believe, is vital. 99% of most economies' economic activity is driven through the SMEs. And nowhere is this more true than Asia. And our system was too cumbersome for them. And the banks have come to us and have said, we need to have far more SMEs in your system. And so that's what we're bringing out this year. I think very, very important for Asia. And this is trying to bring to life the right ones, read many. Asking companies one question, the right question in the right way. So stay with us, partner with us, we want to thank you. And is this year the only change we're going to make? No, it's going to be even better next year. We're sprinting, we're not for profit, so big IT projects are quite stressful for us. You can imagine, they're stressful for everyone. Stay with us, it's going to get better, it's going to get more streamlined, and we will be working to governments to make it better for you so that that data is actually driving change.